because, as I said before, because common law countries have known what trusts are for centuries, that they somehow know how to tax them. Well, that's not really true. So this is the quote over one of the leading UK tax guides from 2009. I'm sure they still say the same thing. A trust is an intermediary which causes considerable difficulty in any tax system. So common law systems that have had trusts for centuries, they found solutions, but it's still sometimes a complete patchwork and mishmash. And it gets very complicated because the problem is you've got all the different variables. So first of all, I'm only going to look at income taxation, but for trusts, you're thinking about income taxation, tax on capital gains, which in common law countries is regarded as totally different, right? And gift and estate inheritance taxation, and wealth tax if there is one, but they're not very common. So first of all, you've got all those differences in the type of tax and the country. That really varies from one country to another. Then we have all the different types of trust I've been talking about, and just shown how incredibly varied they can be, and that they don't fall into neat little categories. You can put these labels on them, but that's just useful descriptions, nothing more than that. And then we've got all sorts of different things that could be a taxable event. Because with trusts, it's not only the income arising, it's when trustees also make a distribution to a beneficiary. So if you've got a discretionary trust, income can arise, be paid to trustees, and then maybe they decide to pay it out to a beneficiary that year or the next year. So there are two possible occasions where you've got to worry about how it's going to be taxed. And the problem is that you've got, in one sense, you've got too many owners, and in the other sense, you've got too few owners. So the too many owners is we've got the legal owners, that's the trustees, and we've got the equitable or beneficial owners, that's the beneficiaries. So you've got two possible owners of income to latch on to. But the problem with discretionary trusts is that you don't have enough owners, because the trustees are clearly the legal owners, and the beneficiaries between them in that cloud are the equitable or beneficial owners, but none of them is entitled to anything. So how can you tax them on something they're not entitled to? But that's where the equitable or beneficial ownership is, not with the trustees, because they're only the legal owners and they're not supposed to be benefiting. So what do you do about it? Well, so all these countries have to deal with, do you regard the trust as generating tax effects, or do you do your best to impose tax as if the trust were not there? And if you're trying to do that, how are you going to do that? So should you allow the existence of the trust to change the tax result? And if you decide that you shouldn't, how are you going to achieve it? Well, there are a number of people you can go for as taxable persons. So the beneficiary is an obvious person. Trustees as a body of persons. So in the diagram I had up there before, I've got a company and two individuals, and I've put an oval around them. So you don't normally tax trustees individually, you tax the body of trustees. So it's not an entity, but it is a body of persons. In the way that the partnership is often a body of persons, but not an entity. So you can tax the trustees as a body of persons. The US and Canada, for tax purposes, deem a trust to be a fictitious person. And in Canada, they go one stage further and they deem it to be an individual. But that's only for tax purposes, so they say there is deemed to be a person there that is the trust. Say that's a fiction, and that's only for tax purposes. Sometimes you tax the settlor or the grantor, and sometimes, in the US especially, the system taxes a person who holds a general power, and a general power is basically the power to interfere in how the trust is run and decide who gets what. How would you do those last two things? Well, there are a number of ways. Do Do you have this slide, or do I keep this one blank?
Yeah, you kept it blank. No, we have it. Like revocability.
All right, darn, I was going to make you do this. Anyway, well, I mean, sort of aside from the things here, in general terms, what do you think should make a person who sets up a trust liable to tax on the income of the trust? Because that happens very often. The settlor, yeah. He's given everything away, yes, but I've talked about all sorts of other things he can do.
If he's also a beneficiary.
Well, if he's also a beneficiary, but then would you be taxing him on? If he's one of a cloud of discretionary beneficiaries, what would you be taxing him on? But then you'd be taxing him as beneficiary, not as settlor. Why would you be taxing someone as settlor? Or grantor, whatever you think.
Transfer the asset like that.
But the moment he transfers the assets,
It's like a sale, like disposal of your.
it is, you dispose of all your assets, but think of all the things he can do. He can retain all those powers. Right, so, as I said, it's like a gift to the beneficiaries through the trustees, but when you give the gift, you can attach all sorts of strings. Right, so one of them is revocability. I'll see, there they all are. So, most countries, if the trust is revocable, tax the settlor as though he never set the trust up in the first place. So all the trust estate and income is still attributed to the settlor. Right, so the trust can exist for 20 years, but if it's revocable, it's the settlor is still being taxed on the income, and not anyone else.
What if he dies?
Well, then you've got a question. At that point, you can't revoke it anymore, right? So then it becomes an irrevocable trust, and then so that part of the tax law stops applying because you can't revoke it. So you attribute it to the settlor, the income to the settlor for as long as he is alive, and in that case, usually for most purposes, the whole trust estate is treated as still belonging to the settlor. So if capital is moved out of the trust to one of the beneficiaries, someone gets a lump of money to buy a house, for example, that's treated as a gift from the settlor to the beneficiary because the trust doesn't exist for tax purposes. The settlor still owns it for tax purposes. So, if, as I say, in most countries, if the trust is revocable, the settlor is still taxed on all the income.
And the beneficiary are exempt.
Sorry?
And the beneficiaries
And only the settlor is taxed, yeah, so it's just taxed on the. I mean, there are 1,001 exceptions, but that's the basic idea. Well, unless the beneficiaries actually get something, so, then that, but it's so complicated, I'll get there in a minute. there are a number of reasons for attributing to the settlor. And it depends, because now I'm talking about it in general terms, for income tax purposes and for capital tax purposes. Revocability is a big one. If the settlor has or might get a beneficial interest in the trust, that sometimes is a reason for taxing the settlor instead of anyone else. That's the basic philosophy in the UK. The basic philosophy in the US is the one underneath, is if the settlor can control how the trust income or capital is applied, which is quite a different thing. So in the UK, the settlor can keep a lot of control over what happens in the trust without being taxed on it, as long as there's no possibility that he will get anything as a beneficiary. But in the US, any amount of control over what happens in the trust makes a settlor taxable. It's actually quite a different test. And that's also, for example, the ability to change beneficial interests. Because one of the powers that you can keep as a settlor or you can give to someone else, is to change the beneficial interest. So I've told you how flexible they can be, but you can also keep the power to change them if you want. Say after 10 years, no, I don't think we'll be paying that income to Johnny anymore. I think we'll give it to someone else. As long as you retain the power when you set up the trust, that's okay. So that ability sometimes makes the settlor a taxable person. The second to last one, control over application of capital or income. In the US, they look at capital or income. In Canada, it's only capital, I think. I've forgotten which one, but it's only one of the two. I think it's capital, but the ability to control income is irrelevant. So already here, you've got very, very different tests for attributing the trust estate to the settlor. So it could be, the big divide, I suppose, is between two middle ones. Is the UK is the possibility of getting something out of the trust, and the US and Canada is being able to control it. Two quite separate things.
So in the first case, after revocability, suppose the settler dies, does all the property in the trust also forms part of his estate?
Depends what the trust deed says.
Well, purely if the trust is revocable?
No, but it depends on what the trust deed says. It always depends on what the trust deed says. So, if the trust deed says it lasts for as long as I live, then it goes back into his estate. But that doesn't usually happen.
No.
You create the trust, you make it revocable. For capital tax purposes, it's usually regarded as part of your estate. At the moment you die, so it's regarded as part of your estate, so it goes into your estate for gifted estate tax purposes. But B, at that point, the power to revoke usually goes to your grave with you. So it's no longer revocable, so it's no longer attributable, so it leaves your estate. So you get gifted estate tax for that reason too. So almost all countries will attribute the estate to the settlor if the trust is revocable. Because that means A, the settlor can get things out of the trust, and B, he's got some sort of control. So it satisfies both tests. So you've already got these huge differences. Right, how do we deal with, and now I'm just talking about in very general terms, income and capital. How do we deal with income? Well, we've got all these different methods of doing it. And they fall into these neat little pairs. So the main methods, there are three main methods. So Australia and New Zealand decide at the outset whether they're going to tax the trustee or the beneficiary. So in the year that the income arises, if the beneficiary gets it, either because he's entitled to it or because someone exercises discretion to give it to the beneficiary is the taxable person. And that's the end of the story. So if dividends arise to the trust and the beneficiary is entitled to them, the beneficiary is taxed as if he received those dividends directly. End of story. Canada and the US and Ireland and the UK basically tax the trustees and the beneficiaries. But in Canada and the US, they tax the trust as a person and then give it a deduction for distributions to beneficiaries and tax the beneficiaries on the distributions. So you avoid economic double taxation that way. And in Ireland and the UK, they tax the trustees and the beneficiary, but the beneficiary gets a credit for the tax paid by the trustee. So you avoid economic double taxation that way. So we've got these little pairs of countries, and these are just a big common look, and these little pairs of countries around the world that have already got these very, very different ways of dealing with trust income. So you can see the mismatches that you can get in international situations if you're not careful. There's the fourth possibility, is that you tax the trustee as the representative of the beneficiary. And I've put that in brackets because that happens in some cases with certain types of trust. So you compute the tax on the basis of the beneficiary's circumstances, but collect and put the liability on the trustee. So that's another way of doing it again. But what they're all trying to do in very broad terms is, if at all possible, get to the position that you would be in if the income had gone directly to the beneficiary. And so if the beneficiary gets the income as of right, or because someone decides to distribute, you can do that. if it's done this year and the same year. So that's okay, you can do that, and then it becomes part of the beneficiary's income, and the beneficiary's marginal rate applies, and the beneficiary's deductions and personal allowances apply. The problem comes with trusts where no beneficiary gets the income. You want to tax someone, and the only people left are the trustees. So then these systems go for the trustee, but then the problem is at some point a beneficiary is going to get something, and you've got to sort it out at that point. And that's when it starts getting really seriously complicated. So, as I say, the main idea is to tax as though the income went to the beneficiary directly, but the problem is with discretionary trusts, for example, where you simply can't do that. There's no one else to go for, except for the trustees. But the detail of these things is horrendously complicated when, countries go for the beneficiary or the trustees. And so that you get huge mismatches there as well. And then if the beneficiary does get something, so let's say you have a trust that's got a large portfolio of shareholdings and they're all paying dividends, and some, because you can have mixtures, of course, you can have the trust where half of the income, there's someone with an interest in possession, so someone is entitled to half the income right now as it arises, and for the other half it's a discretionary trust. So let's say you have a large portfolio of shareholdings and they're all paying dividends, and you've got a beneficiary who's entitled to half that income as it arises, and let's say it's not only dividends, it's also rent from houses and things like that, huge sort of trust. For tax purposes, then, what is it that the beneficiary is getting? Because that might make a difference. You might have one of these systems that have got, and there might be a business in the trust as well. So maybe part of the trust is carrying on the business of the family farm or the family shop or something like that. So there's business profit in there and dividends. And so, many countries, when they're taxing individuals, make a distinction between those two types of income. And you've got a beneficiary who's entitled to half the income of the trust as it arises. Well, what's the beneficiary getting? Is it dividends? Is it profit? Business profit? Or is it something else? What do you think? Not thinking anything at the moment. Well, again, it varies from one country to another. So in some countries, the original income flows through. But in Canada, the basic rule is that anything you get from a trust acquires a different character. So it's now periodic income, it's trust income. So it's necessarily different from the dividends that went into the trust, even if you're entitled to it as it arises.
Why would it anyways constitute dividends?
Well, because it's the shareholdings that are paying into the trust.
But there are no shares.
No, the part of the trust estate is a large portfolio of shareholdings.
So we are talking about the income derived by the beneficiary, right?
Well, but this is the whole problem. So you've got trustees who the trust estate includes shareholdings in a number of companies.
Yeah.
So they're paying dividends, right, to the trustees, because the trustees are the people on the share register. And the trustees then are paying something to the beneficiaries, right? So the beneficiaries up here. So let's say these two are entitled to, between them, to half of the trust income, so they get a quarter each. So the trustees are paying something out of the trust to the beneficiaries. And then the question is, what's the character of this? So some countries say, well, dividends went in and you're entitled to it as it arises, so it's dividends that go out. But Canada says, I don't care what goes in, this is a trust distribution, and that's in another sort of a specific type of specific category of income. And then if you do have, let's say you've got these two are entitled to a quarter each of the trust income, right?
Yep.
And then the other half, you've got some discretionary beneficiaries, and and there's a question there: is anything going to be appointed to them? So we've got a question mark here. Might they get something? You could also have this case, and then the question is: you've got, well, I've put 3 shareholdings, but perhaps there are 20, and perhaps they change during the year. What do you do? Do you go around and you take a quarter of each of these and give a quarter to the trustee, or do you do it some other way? I mean, it can get horrendously complicated. And if what's down here is not only shareholdings, but we've got, as I say, this is the issue where you've got, for example, a business, and this is one of the reasons very often for setting up a trust. The business is a family farm, or it's a big family business. Grandfather set it up, and he wants the farm to stay in the family, or he wants the business to stay in the family, but there's no one who wants to take it over as the great leader. So he puts it into trust to make sure it all stays together. So you put the farm into the trust to make sure it all stays together, to keep it together. You appoint a manager to run the business. The trustees appoint a manager, or maybe one of them does it themselves, to keep it together. And all the beneficiaries are the yuppie grandchildren who have no intention of living in their welly boots on the farm. They want to be in the city with their smartphones stuck to their ear, right? But you still want them to have the income. So you put the farm in there, and then maybe there are other bits and pieces of money as well, so you invest them in some shareholdings. But the main purpose of the trust might be to keep the farm together, or the family business. And the money, the extra money that's not used for these people, has to be parked somewhere and invested, so it gets put in some shareholdings. Right? So then you've got this mixture of things coming into the trust, and if you do have this situation, how are you going to work it out? Do you say this quarter consists of those shares, or do you do a quarter of everything? I mean, all that depends on domestic law. So this already gets horribly complicated, and we haven't crossed any borders yet. We haven't crossed any national borders. So you can imagine what it gets like when you do start trying to cross national borders. If the investments are in another country, or if the beneficiaries, and you can control where the investments go, but you can't always control where the beneficiaries go. What if they move to the Netherlands? And the Netherlands doesn't know what a trust is. Now what? So this is why it gets so horrendously complicated. So you've got not only the question of who's taxed on it. So in this case, in most common law states, as I say, these beneficiaries would be taxed on that quarter each year. And if some of this, in the same year it arises, is paid to one of these people, they would be taxed on it. But if it arises in 2000 and is paid out to one of these people in 2001, is it still income, or has it been accumulated, and are they being given a lump of capital? So you've got to have rules to decide all of those things, because where can the distribution come from? It can be made from all sorts of sources. So it can come from current income, so it can, got a dividend, all right, I'll pay half of it, pay some of it to Fred. It can be accumulated income, so they've kept it for 5 years and then they pay something for one of these people. They can make a capital gain because maybe in the course of managing their shareholdings, they've bought and sold some of these shareholdings, and some of the shareholdings made a gain whilst they were. So that gain could be used to fund some of these things, or the payment could be made out of trust corpus, which is the capital that was put into the trust in the first place. So you can make distributions out of all of those things. And then you've got the question, how are you going to characterise it up here? And that depends on the domestic law. So this is my question of flow through. I mean, the flow through stays dividends all the way. If we've got, a national border here, we've got a national border here, let's say this is the UK. No, I have to say England For these things, Scots law is different. So we're talking about the UK when we're talking about taxation, but Scots law on property is very, very different from English law. So I have to say England. This is an English trust, and it makes investments in American companies. And there's a distribution. Is the geographical source America, because that's where the dividend came from? Or is it England, because that's where the trust is? So you've also got and if there's double tax relief, so there's been some withholding tax down, who gets the double tax relief? Is it the trustees or is it the beneficiary? It gets very complicated. Horrendously. This is why there can be such a big problem. If we look at the enforcement, let me just say something about enforcement. How are you going to enforce all of this? Well, one of these days I'll learn to.
Why doesn't any country then apply the same concept which it applies to partnerships? I mean, in partnerships, either it's complete flow through or partnership is treated as a separate entity and it's taxed like that. But over here, they're taxing the trustee, and then again, the beneficiary might as well just tax the trustee or just the beneficiary. I mean, for computational purposes, definitely they could use the trust and then distribute the income, whatever they are.
Yeah,
So,
except that for policy reasons, what they're usually trying to do is get to the stage where you're taxing these beneficiaries as if they receive the dividends directly. But the problem is you've got to have all these rules to cope with cases where there's no one who's entitled to the income as it arises. And it's also just, to a certain extent, historical accident. A lot of these rules have grown, maybe slightly haphazardly through the centuries, and we're now stuck with the system, and that's just the way we've done it, always. We always do it like that. And so this is why you end up with this system. So, I mean, I know England, the UK best when it comes to tax law, obviously. And there are all sorts of special schemes and special rules that have been developed to deal as a response to certain issues and to help out certain types of trust, and it's become an absolute tangle and nightmare, and that's the same in all the countries, basically. I mean, it's never really been thought up rationally. I mean, I once heard a US professor who's one of the leading authorities on the taxation of trust in the US describe it as an absolute junk heap of a system. Just such a complete mishmash. And he said it would be nice to have a system that looks as though someone designed it on purpose. But that's not the way it is. And this is the problem of starting from where we are now. If you're starting from a blank page, you might be able to get together and come up with a rational, consistent system, but that's just not the way it is. How do you enforce it? Well, one of the things you can do is that you can make the trustees withhold tax, which is a prepayment of the beneficiary's liability. Because how do you know that the beneficiaries are receiving anything? Because the company pays dividends, but how do you know that a beneficiary is getting it? Because the trust is not registered anywhere. There's no public register of trusts or anything like that. So you basically put as many obligations as you can on the trustees, because they're the responsible ones carrying out their fiduciary duty. So they have to go to the tax authority and get a tax identification number, and they have to provide tax returns for the trust. And you can make them withhold tax on distributions to the beneficiaries. And there's also what I call true withholding, which is where these, the investments, these guys have to make the withholding. And then the question is, if tax is withheld here, who gets a credit for it? And that depends usually on who's taxed on it. What about the problems under treaties? I haven't put a slide for that, but what do you think the issues might be under income tax treaties? When we're trying to apply a treaty to flows of income going to a trust. I mean, if these are English trustees investing in American companies and there are dividends being paid out, and so there's a treaty, what are the treaty problems that you see?
it doesn't get categorized in Article 10 because it's not a dividend payback.
Well, this is a dividend,
Yeah, paid by a company, but whether
paid
trust
by
is
a
a
company.
resident is considered as a resident or not. So,
Whether it's the characterisation one applies to this arrow, not to this arrow. So this is
Yeah.
clearly dividend. But if there's a national border here, because your beneficiary moved to Iceland, then there's a question: is this a dividend? Is Iceland going to regard this as a dividend? Can the trustees get the benefit of a treaty?
That is the main issue, I think.
That's the other. I mean, that's the really big issue.
I mean, if
trustees are a body of persons.
yeah, you mentioned it.
They are a body of persons, but then, if you agree that they're a body of persons, then what are the two big issues?
Are they liable to tax?
Yeah, they're usually liable to tax, but the problem is, what if they're in different countries? So, this is a professional trustee, and this is Uncle Fred, who moved to Belgium last year. So then the question is, where are they resident? You've got this body of trustees, but where is it resident? So determining the residence of a body of trustees is already a big problem. And in all these countries, guess what? They have different rules for deciding where a body of trustees is resident for domestic purposes. We're not even talking about treaties yet. But just for deciding where a body of trustees is resident, they will have different rules under their domestic law. So it starts there. Can they get treaty benefits? Well, then where are they liable to tax? That depends on the domestic law, which is different. So you can get yourself into a right mess there. Then what's the problem? Let's assume that they're both resident in the same country, or that it's clear that the body of trustees is liable to tax in one country. Then what's the problem? If you're trying to claim Article 10. There's a big problem staring you in the face.
I mean, then does US consider it as a tax person, like
Well,
for
the US,
applying Article 10 as trusts?
well, I mean, the US thinks that trusts are fictitious persons anyway, so that's not a problem. But there's a big issue there with Article 10 staring you in the face. You're going to kick yourself and I'll tell you what the problem is. For claiming the benefit of it. Sorry? I know, I've been talking a long time. It's Monday. Come on, someone must be able to find it.
The beneficial
Beneficial
owner.
owner.
Oh,
Are
I
they the
got.
beneficial owner? How can they be the beneficial owner when, by definition, these are the people who are in the beneficial owners? So we've got a huge problem with trustees and beneficial ownership. So can they be the beneficial owner? So, and are they the beneficial owner of the dividends? The beneficiary is clearly the beneficial owner of something, but is the beneficiary the beneficial owner of this arrow, or is he the beneficial owner of this arrow? So that's a problem, but the big problem is with trustees, because I've just told you, by definition, they can't be what are called beneficial owners under property law, because it's a fiduciary position. So then you have to have the argument, and well, can they be beneficial owners for treaty purposes? Yes, that's a different type of beneficial ownership. So there are, in this case, for example, for this half of the trust income, let's say nothing is paid out to these beneficiaries in 2016. Maybe something's paid out at the end of 2017, but in 2016, nothing is paid out. And there's a treaty here, and there's a treaty there, and there's a treaty there. So, I mean, there are treaties all around. So someone should be able to get... I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it, if no one can claim treaty benefits, because we've got treaties all the way around. So how can you maintain that position, then, that no one gets treaty benefits because we don't have a beneficial owner? The only possibility is that you regard the trustees as beneficial owner and able to get the benefit of this treaty. It's the only way to make treaties work. Because how silly is it? As I say, when you've got treaties all the way around, you say, oh, I can't find a beneficial owner. I know there are treaties all the way around, but I'm not applying any single one of them. I mean, how sensible is that? So New Zealand in its treaties, I think all of them now, specifically puts a provision in there saying, because in New Zealand, remember, decides when the income arises whether to tax the trustee or the beneficiary, and that's the end of it. So if these beneficiaries New Zealand would tax, and not the trustee, and to treat them as receiving the dividend and the profit. These beneficiaries New Zealand would tax if they got something in 2016. If they didn't get anything in 2016, New Zealand will tax the trustees, and that's the end of the story. So New Zealand puts in all its treaties a provision saying that if the trustees are taxable, and that only happens when no one is entitled to the income as it arises, in that case, the trustees are to be treated as beneficial owners for treaty purposes. It specifically puts that in its treaties. Australia has the same rule about choosing the trustees or the beneficiaries straight off, but doesn't put that in its treaties. And I asked a professor from Australia once why they don't do that, and he said, "Oh, that's a good question." End of answer. I have no idea why Australia has not copied this. It just seems to be asking for trouble. But New Zealand's the only country I know that does it. In the other countries, the four main common law countries, UK, Ireland, Canada and the US, the trustees are always taxable. So you arguably have a different problem but in Canada and UK, as I say, Canada and the US, distributions are deductible by the trustees, and in Ireland and the UK, the beneficiaries get a credit for the trustee tax. But in all cases, theoretically, there's a liability on the trustees. So there is possibly an argument there that the trustees are theoretically taxable on this income, and for that reason you could argue that for treaty purposes they should be regarded as beneficial owners. But this is a big issue as to how you apply the beneficial ownership requirement to trustees. And when the OECD did its partnership report, they put at the end this jolly little paragraph which said, right, okay, good, we've sorted out partnerships now, so we'll keep going and we'll sort out trusts, and it never happened, and it never happened, and it never happened, and it never happened. And I asked someone at some point, when are you going to come out with a report on trusts? Oh, well, that's difficult. It never happened. Because of all these complications. They'd underestimated how difficult it was going to be. That's the subject of our new. So, how can you use them for tax avoidance purposes? Another quotation from way back, 97, but it still applies. It is likely that no ethereal invention has had a greater impact on tax minimisation in common law countries than that of trust, which is true. So despite me saying that huge numbers of trusts are set up for purely genuine non-tax reasons to provide for my autistic nephew and sort out my former colleague and her ugly stepsisters and all those things, you still see an awful lot of them being used for tax avoidance. And why is that? Well, you can do all these things. So you can change the ownership of income, right? So you can do all these things with them. So instead of one person owning all the income, you can use a trust to split it up among a load of people and use all their lower rates and their personal allowances. You can change its source, depending on the domestic law of the country, so you can make it come from a different place, if you want, if the domestic law does that, by putting it through a trust. You can change its character if domestic law does that. So in Canada, you can use a trust to change its character. It changes from dividends to something else. You can change the timing. This is a big one. So you can pay out, if you've got a discretionary trust, you can decide to make your distributions at times when beneficiaries don't have much income that year, so you use up all their allowances and their lower rate bands, so you can change the timing of income. And the big one is you can change income into capital. So instead of just giving people a shareholding and they're taxed on the dividends all the time, you let it sit in the trust, you accumulate it for 10 or 20 years, and then you give them a chunk of capital. And very often the taxation on that, and the gift and estate tax, can be much friendlier than taxation on 20 years worth of dividends. So you can build it all up in the trust, and then hand out lumps of capital. How do countries deal with it? Well, they have all sorts of special regimes about. I mean, the tax avoidance law to do with trusts is unbelievable in some countries, just phenomenal.
What's PFIF?
I'm getting there. So
Okay.
then it's a sort of a version of an attribution of personal foreign investment fund.
Mm.
So it's like the individual equivalent of a CFC regime,
Yeah.
right? So countries sometimes, if people are entitled to, well, if they're entitled straight away to the income, they're very often taxed on it. But you have a PFIF or personal foreign investment fund regime. So it's when you use a trust to park your investments outside the country. A CFC regime doesn't apply because the CFC regime is a controlled foreign company. The trust is not a company, but you adopt a similar sort of regime that applies to trusts. And the rates of tax is a very simple one. If you tax trustees at the highest marginal rate on individuals, there's no incentive to use them at home for tax planning purposes, is there? So if trustees are always taxed at the top marginal rate, then you stop all sorts of games like that at home. And it might later be credited, for example, by the beneficiaries, but at least you've got it at the top margin, so you stop people just using a trust to accumulate income at home. So a lot of countries have special rules about the rates of tax on trust to stop games like that.
I have a question. I mean, let's say the settler gives certain amount of wealth, whatever he
Yeah.
has. So basically, even the trust will have to maintain its tax books or books
Yeah.
of accounts. So the wealth would form part of the corpus fund,
Yeah.
and this fund would be invested. So basically, let's say there's 100 wealth and 100 of investments.
Yeah.
So assuming the tax law of the country of where the trust is the same as the Netherlands, and it also recognizes the trust, and it has a box 3 income for savings and investments. So anyways, the investments would be valued at the market value, and the
Yeah.
trustee would have to pay taxes. So how would there be a change in the timing of income, because anyways the country is getting the revenue
Well, in
of that year?
In that case, there wouldn't. But when I say the timing of income, you can change the timing of. You can't change the timing of income to the trustees. It arises as it arises, but you can change the timing to the beneficiaries,
Okay.
and that might be very valuable.
Mm.
So that's. But and if your trustee body of trustees happens to be on the Channel Islands or in the Cayman Islands, then you've also taken it out of the clutches of a lot of other taxing jurisdictions that would want to tax it a lot more than the Channel Islands do, and then you just pay it out to the beneficiaries as and when they need it, instead of it going to them directly.
Then practically, if trust is such a good tool to plan taxes, then why do we not see many structures where trusts are involved, and we still see structures where subsidiaries are involved or PEs are involved? But why not
Well,
trust?
because that's also two answers. One is countries have huge amounts of tax avoidance legislation applying to trusts, but it's also a historical thing. In Australia, a lot of businesses used to be carried out through trusts rather than companies, because the tax regime for trusts was more favourable than it is for companies. So there used to be economic double taxation on companies, but not on trusts. They've now changed that to take away the difference. But traditionally, a lot of Australian small businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, were carried on through trusts. And everyone's used to it, and they find that perfectly normal. So when you see businesses that, it's not unlimited. If you see this after, I think that's what it is, after an Australian business name, that's proprietary, I think, and it means it's carried on through a trust. So Australians are used to carrying on business through trusts, and it's a historical thing. People are used to it. Other countries are not. So you can't, for example, in civil law countries, do it because civil law countries don't recognise trusts. They don't know what to do with them. it's a huge risk to try and use them because the tax authority doesn't know what to do with them. So you just wouldn't take the risk. In other common law countries that do know the concept, it's history. People just don't. They're just not used to it. So in international tax planning, it can be really risky because of all the mismatches. Because you've got civil law countries that don't know trusts and hate the tax inspectors, hate them because they don't know what to do with them. So they're going to be very hostile. As soon as they see the trust name, their claws come out and they're very hostile. And you've got all these mismatch problems and all the problems with treaties. You don't know how other tax authorities are going to react to trusts and treaties either. So you can use them, and they are used if you're very clever about it, but there are limits. And the use is generally more for family estate planning than for multinationals, for example.
What if there is inside the assets of the trust, a company, something productive?
Well, that's what I've got here.
So I think what you're saying is, can multinationals use this?
You could, yeah, but they don't for all the reasons I've just said. And in many countries, if someone's doing business with a multinational and they're told they're not dealing with the company, they're dealing with trustees, their reaction is going to be, what? Huh? I thought I was dealing with a serious business. It's also partly just sort of background, historical background and cultural expectations. People don't expect to deal with a trust, they expect to deal with a subsidiary. Unless they're Australian. For some, Australians are used to it. And if it's purely domestic in the UK, it might be a different thing, for example. But, so for business purposes, you wouldn't normally use them for all those reasons. But for estate planning purposes, for individuals, is where they use more for estate planning and tax planning. And this was the problem, for example, they had in the Netherlands. A long time ago, I went down to the Ministry of Finance here. They had some working group on trusts, and they asked me to go and discuss things with them. And they'd seen a number of cases where they had a Dutch resident individual whose estate was 4 million guilders at the time, who created a trust in the Channel Islands, and then this was when there was a real wealth tax in the Netherlands. So 1 year he would report 4 million, and the next year he'd report 1 million. And the tax was, where did the 3 million go? Well, I put it in trustees on the Channel Islands. Okay, well, who's got it now then? Well, the trustees on the Channel Islands. Yes, but who's got the benefit from it? Well, no one. What do you mean no one? Well, it's a discretionary trust. No one's got the benefit from it. Well, who can I tax then? Well, no one. You must have given it to someone. No, I gave it to trustees on the Channel Islands. You can't get them because they're not the beneficial owners. Frustration. So, and it's not only the Netherlands. A lot of civil law countries in Europe, especially, have had this same problem, that they see huge amounts of money going out of individuals' estates, and then they're told, no one's got that money. It doesn't belong to anyone. I didn't give it to anyone. It's just being sat on by trustees. So that also creates hostility. So it can be a bit dicey to use trust because you'll just meet hostility in a lot of countries, large amounts of it. And in the Netherlands, it's still unclear to a certain extent, and on purpose as well. I mean, they were very clear. No, we're not going to clear this up. We want to make it risky to use trusts. We want to scare people off.
But now the Netherlands in general would say that the 3 million that was gone would be taxed with the same person.
Yeah, I mean now there's because the law has changed.
Now, since
the law has changed it, so they
Yeah.
regard it as you're still owning it.
Yeah, since 2010.
Unless you can show that unless you can show it belongs beneficially to someone else, basically,
Yeah.
right? You're still taxed as owning it. So the Netherlands has changed that, but there's a huge amount of hostility for those reasons towards trust because people don't understand them, and they think they're sneaky, backhanded, devious tax avoidance devices. which they can be, but you know, to be perfectly genuine. Yeah, there's a huge amount to say about trusts, but I'm not going to bore you.
If you could send us that, the Waters, Devon Waters.
Donovan Waters.
Yeah.
It's huge. It's 300.
Oh, you said it was an article.
Yeah, I also said it was 340 pages.